So, good evening. We are very happy to present tonight the second book in practice about the project Lichtervelde Youth House from Raamwerk Architects. Before starting the discussion, I just want to briefly explain what In Practice is generally about and say some words about this book in particular. In Practice is an inter-university research group of practicing architects engaging their practice at the heart of their research. In Practice create links between professional architecture practices and academic research and seeks to open space for architecture practices in research through the development of doctoral and postdoctoral research projects, conferences and publication. It is a joint initiative of KU Leuven Faculty of Architecture and ULiège Faculty of Architecture, and the Faculty of Architecture of ULB now also supports this project. The objective of the In Practice books is to unveil the design process of a project through a set of working documents and in parallel through text. This double narration of the design process through working documents and text is developed by the architects with an external expert, but also with the graphic designer who plays a central role in the work. In this case, we have invited Bart Decroos as an expert to work with Geers and Frit den Droeven van Raamwerk, and we work for the graphic design with Orphée Grandhomme and Ismaël Benani, who already realized the first In Practice book that you can find here at the entrance. The books are aimed both the academic world and the professional world. The book about Raamwerk unfolds the design process of Lichtervelde Youth House Center. Through 4 anecdotes, they explore how the reality of the construction site allowed them to continue the design during the realization of the building itself. 3 additional contributions open discussions on the level of research, pedagogics, and theory. We would like to thank all the participants and supports of the book: Raamwerk, Bart Decroos, Ismaël and Orphée, Stijn Bollard, the photographer, our universities, KU Leuven, ULB and ULiège, SIVA for hosting the event, the Flemish government and Velux. To explore the topic of the book, we have the pleasure to introduce Rolf Hughes and Bart Decroos, who will open a discussion around it. Rolf Hughes is professor in the epistemology of design-led research at KU Leuven and director artistic research for the experimental architecture groups. Rolf was twice elected vice president of the International Society for Artistic Research and has supported several European national research councils in the strategic development, implementation and evaluation of artistic and design-led research, related doctoral programs and center of excellence. Bart Decroos is an architect, researcher and editor. He is currently running a PhD on the work of John Ruskin through the lens of contemporary ecological theory at the University of Antwerp. He is member of the editorial board of OAS, Journal of Architecture, and he is co-author of the Raamwerk In Practice book. Rolf, Bart, thanks a lot for being here with us today, and the floor is yours. Rolf is not present here, but Bart, yes, so maybe you can come here.
Great, okay. So first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's really to be there in spirit. It's really nice to be part of this conference, and it's really great to see how some initiatives that I was involved in some years ago are really bearing fruit at KU Leuven and elsewhere, particularly the notion of practice-led research in architecture. It's really wonderful to see the growth of that field. So we're here to celebrate and explore the book Raamwerk, excuse my Swedish pronunciation, which is a really, I have to say, a really beautiful book. It has really incredible images and drawings And it gives, I think, a very strong feel of the place and of the process. And what I really appreciate about it is it does that in a way that's a living space. It doesn't negate mess and complexity and contradiction and those things that often are, certainly in a sort of modern mindset, tend to be eliminated from sort of architectural accounts and representations. So I really see it as a sort of celebratory book on lots of different levels. Working in a way that I like to work, often with very little budget and with a sort of with a very sort of collaborative spirit with the people on the ground there. The story of the building and of the process is told through images and text, and there is a sort of ongoing negotiation and discussion about the relationship between these two. The book starts with a quote from Foucault's Cécile et Pipe, in which Foucault seems to see word and image as a power struggle. That there's a sort of constant battle for supremacy between text and image. I'm not sure I agree with that. I've designed a course in Sweden which is called Word and Image, which is actually exploring artists' work that actually combine these two in ways, the graphical qualities of the word and the textual qualities of the image, plus other materials, as well as sound and architecture and materials like glass and textiles and so on. So I think Foucault has been very literal here in many ways. I'm not sure that he really is so well informed about some sort of contemporary conceptual artists such as Joseph Kosuth and others. But just to highlight that sort of theme of word and image, which is running through the book. There is, I think, the word generosity is mentioned in the book on page 54, and I think that is a good way of characterising the book as a whole. It's a very generous book in the way it sort of opens up a process and a contribution to a local community in a very sort of generous way. One of the ways it does this is through what it calls short stories, what the authors call short stories. And again, I think this is a nice tactic. I speak as somebody who comes from that sort of background in, particularly interested in writing about architecture, but also writing short stories and prose poems and the like. And in my experience, what the short story allows you to do is render experience in all its complexity and contradictions. So I think it's a very good form for architects because it allows you to, shift points of view, perspective, all these terms that are shared between literature and architecture. Who is standing where to say what or to see what, and with what motivations, etc. These are sort of questions you ask of short stories, but you can also ask them of architectural projects. And then there is another term that's used alongside stories, which is anecdotes, and particularly the idea of anecdotal evidence. And there is a claim here that anecdotal evidence is important, and it tends to be one of the things that's repressed by, shall we say, conventional or scientific or humanities-based research. Anecdotal evidence is considered untrustworthy because it's anecdotal. And yet, with the development of research into other fields such as design-led research and artistic research, which I've been heavily involved in for more than 20 years now, those sort of factors are the very strength of that type of research, because instead of repressing the body, it brings the body back in, and that means it brings the things that the modern mindset have also repressed, such as the senses, experience, difference, complexity, and so on. So I just want to sort of dwell on that, because we've got, first of all, what I'm leading towards is to ask the question about the difference, since we're part of an event that's titled Practices in Research. I want to really frame these sort of different approaches in relationship to research and ask the question I'm leading towards is, what is the difference between a case study and research? And so I just, before I get there, need to unpack that a bit further, because the technique of short stories is claimed, and yet the 4 stories, which are the brick, the roof, doors and windows, I'm missing one, maybe that's it. The brick, the roof, doors and windows. They are actually presented as descriptions, explanations, and justifications. So you could say, instead of using the terms of the short story, or the story, which might be factors like conflict and crisis and resolution, to take a very classic Aristotelian view, conflict, crisis, resolution, there's your narrative arc. Very typical of many short stories, but these are not using that mode, they're using the modes of actually the case study or the academic essay in many respects, explanation, description, and justification. So I would say in that respect, they are at the level of description rather than the level of making a claim. And I would like to sort of offer this idea for discussion, that it's when you introduce the idea of the claim that you engage with a sort of research conversation. Something is being claimed. When you have a level of description, and again, I'm very happy to debate this because it's more complex than I'm making it out, but when you remain at the level of description or the case study, you have in this case, an extremely well articulated case study, beautifully illustrated and celebrated through word and image, as I described. But the onus is put onto the receiver or the reader to say, and now you unpack it as research. And I think that's there because the claim is not so explicit in this case. So I would really like to, I've got a lot of other questions, but I think it's quite useful to start with that one, to basically say, what is the difference between a case study and a research agenda? Is it, as your reading of Foucault proposes, quote, the focus on the anecdotal nature of architecture in text proposes a shift from interpretive knowledge towards transformative operationality. Beyond, quote, what is it, what does it mean? The question, brackets, also, close brackets, becomes, what did they do, what does it allow? So, I don't know if that's enough there to get things going, but the basic question is the more general question about the difference between a case study and a research presentation.
I think that's a lot to start with. I will try to answer your question by taking a kind of detour through what we tried to do with the book, addressing some of the words or the terms you used, the idea of the story, of the anecdote, of the claim, which may or may not be explicit. Also for the audience to kind of situate more precisely what we're talking about. This book, as you already saw in the spreads, is really about the construction process of a building. In contrast to the first book, which was about the design process. And as Rolf said, the interest in addressing the construction process of a building is because both Frick and Geers of Raamwerk and myself as a researcher are quite interested in this messy reality of the construction site, and how this messy reality and all the unforeseen circumstances define or change or transform the initial design. And I guess that's why we defined the 4 anecdotes we describe in the book as short stories. I'm happy you referred to Aristotle, to his conflict, crisis, resolution. because I think it works the way we envisioned it. The 4 short stories, you could say, they all start with a kind of conflict. There's an initial design which was drawn on the drawing table by the architects, and it comes into conflict with the reality of constructing it. And something unexpected comes up, which questions the design. To what extent can you push through the design and project it onto reality, and where do you take reality into account and allow it to transform the design itself? And so this is the crisis, the moment of questioning, also of dialogue with contractors, with engineers, with craftsmen, with the client. And in the end there's a resolution, which in the 4 stories we tell is a kind of transformation or enrichment or refinement of what was initially the intention. So I think what we try to do fits kind of within this idea of what stories are according to Aristotle, apparently. But we call them also anecdotes because they are not, let's say the conflict is nothing big. Usually, or in all 4, it's very, very ordinary, you could say. It's about an unexpected deviation in the tolerance of the bricks, about a measurement mistake for the windows and doors, a discussion between an engineer and a contractor about the structure of the building, and a kind of political debate around a single wall. And so these are kind of anecdotal. We describe them because these are the things that happen almost in all construction sites all over Belgium, I guess. These are the things architects deal with when they step onto the construction site. And so they are stories, but also quite anecdotal stories, but which nonetheless doesn't mean they are not important. And I guess that would be the kind of claim we try to make with this book, that this process that happens on the construction site, and which is taken as a kind of self-evident reality in most cases, which is rarely addressed in publications or in research, at least up until a few years ago, I think. We try to claim that this is where architecture also gets made. It's not only about the design by the architect, which is then just realized, this classical distinction of diseño, but it's as much, it happens as much on the construction site itself. I don't know if that addresses a little bit what you were aiming at.
It's a very good answer, and I agree with you. I think it's very nicely rendered through there, because what your answer did was to remind me that the claim can be implicit rather than explicit. And conventionally in research, we demand that it's made explicit. You hear people saying, "What is the research question you're addressing?" And that can work for certain types of research, but it doesn't always work with practitioners in design and the arts, because, as you know, often the starting point is not a question that has to be unpacked, but rather a process that has to be explored and that leads you into the wilderness. And then from that, patterns emerge and questions maybe multiply rather than reduce. So there's a sort of reverse, arguably scientific research, there's a distillation that's going on. There's maybe a reverse process where there's a complexification going on. So questions multiply rather than become purified and distilled in that way. And I think that's a very good, Bart, your answer is a very good way of thinking about this book. In that, you can say in terms of giving an account or staging an encounter with the research contribution of a work, those are two terms that I've used. First, giving an account after the Judith Butler essay, which is giving an account of oneself, which I thought was a very useful essay, because it raises not least the ethical dimension of giving an account of oneself and another person, which typically you do at funerals, and it's a very ethically, demanding task. You can apply that to the challenge, the ethical challenge of giving an account of an artwork or of a design work, and trying to speak from within its own logic rather than project onto it your own agenda. So trying to let it breathe and speak on its own terms. So I started off with that, but I still thought that was too logocentric. It's still too much based on the word. So the idea of exposition or staging an encounter with the work, such that its research contributions start to become either explicit or implicit, seemed to me a much more appropriate sort of way of thinking about this. So you can say that, in the sort of motivations or strategies of explanation, there's, on the one side, there's those that belong to what you could call a transparent model, where things are stated explicitly. The genre used is typically explanation, clarification, primary and secondary sources, all the things that we use, for example, in scholarly academic research. And then on the other side, and they're not really on opposing sides, but rather they're more like a sort of spiral perhaps, where they keep overlapping. But there's things like complexity and opacity and density, where you encounter the work, you are in the presence of the work, but its meaning is not necessarily being spelt out, or its claim or its contribution is not necessarily being defined. So the research contribution is being in proximity to the work, and then the work facilitates a research type conversation. And so I now, happily contradict my earlier point, because I think that, in a sense, the arrival of a book like this permits, because it doesn't have an explicit claim, but it has a sort of anecdotal presence, it permits many parts of arrival and departure, if I can put it that way, in the same way that a short story does. If we had a workshop around a short story, we would have that type of conversation, and I think this book would work in a similar way, that you can have many parts of arrival and departure to it and from it and even through it, but it's not claiming one specific approach, which is what a typical research application would do. I will explore the following things using the following methods and materials and teams, and my outcome will be likely this, this, and this. So I think in that respect, it's a really good example of practicing research, which is what we're here for anyway. But I wanted to sort of actually dig a question that relates to that. So I wanted to ask you about to describe the collaboration between what is described as on page 160, collaboration between the architects and the academic researcher, which is you. So here you have a separation, the architects and the academic researcher. And again, the architects I think are described as sort of producing photographs and images and so on, as well as the work, of course. And the academic researcher presumably is the one that sort of comes in and provides text. But then you've had this sort of multiple, or this co-authorship, or this, what we like to call in the experimental architecture group, composting. You take a text and you compost it because different people are working their chemistry on it until you no longer know who did what, and no longer care, because the chemical reaction is more interesting than ideas of authorship. So could you say a few words about the nature of the collaboration, and perhaps for the audience that necessarily read the book?
I quite like the term composting. I think it's quite representative of what we did. To situate the main text of the book, which describes the construction process of the project, was written by Freek, Geers and myself together. And practically this meant we had a lot of conversations about what the book had to become, which were recorded and transcribed. There were a lot of versions going back and forth with editing the text. And in the end, indeed, the authorship becomes quite unclear. And I guess you could say it's a kind of hybrid authorship, which I think also relates back to this idea of being explicit or implicit about the claim you're making. Because I think in the text, if I look back on it now, you sense that the text starts from a kind of very concrete observations and memories about how the process unfolded. But it meanders between these concrete observations, descriptions, more distant reflections, and it goes back and forth. And I think the three different voices that sat around the table and which kind of composed it into this one single text, this meandering and this going back and forth still seems to me to be present in the text, but it is not clear completely where one ends and the other begins, which might be the reason why the claim of this book is less explicit as in a traditional research paper with a clear author who claims something.
Thank you. I don't know how we're doing for time. I ask another question, or I don't know if you want to open it up to the audience. I had a question about the dialogue, but...
Sorry, Rolf. Thanks a lot, but we don't have so much time, so thanks a lot for the exchange. I think it was very interesting, also for us. We will just start with the conferences now. Thanks a lot, both of you, and thanks for Raamwerk and all the people who work on the book. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. I won't be long to introduce the conference. Thank you very much to all the speakers, and sorry to cut this very interesting conversation. So tonight, to conclude this intense day, we have the pleasure to have two lecturers for what we call an In Practice conference. In Practice is a series of conferences where we invite architects to unveil one of their projects through work documents, so to dissect, in a sense, the genesis of a project, to share the depth, to extract mechanisms that lead to choices, and also to discover maybe intuitions that make poetry. So as Rolf was mentioning, maybe instead of asking what is it or what it means, this project, the question becomes what did they do and what does it allow? Tonight, so two lectures. The first one by David van Severen. Thank you for being with us tonight. David, I don't know if I really have to introduce him. So he's an engineer architect graduated from the UGent and the ETSAM in Madrid. And he has founded with Kersten Geers office, Kersten Geers, David van Severen in 2002. And since then, there's been, I would say, one of the most influential voices in contemporary architecture. Office produces idiosyncratic architecture, in which realization and theoretical projects stand side by side. The projects are direct, spatial, and rooted in theory. Tonight, we'll have the pleasure to go in depth in one of their recent projects, which is called Dar al-Jina, which is one of two parallel buildings, I would say, that they've completed in Bahrain, and which, as Kersten Geers was defining a few weeks ago in another lecture, could be called a big house, so a house that is neither public nor completely private, but a house that hosts maybe ever-changing communities. Here it's a house that gives a public face to actually a community of pearl fishers, and the music they have been creating in the last decades or century, I would say. Then we have the second lecture by Rolf Fallon from AgwA. Rolf Fallon graduated from the Catholic University of Leuven and Louvain. and he has been teaching in KU Leuven here in Brussels since many years, and he completed his PhD at RMIT in Melbourne about and through the work of AgwA. AgwA is in, I would say, in 2008. He founded AgwA with Benoit van den Bulk, more or less in 2008. And since then, we have been working on many public projects, mainly. AgwA sees construction as the carrier of the cultural sustainability of architecture, and also as the place where the critical potentialities of architecture emerges. Tonight, Harold will unveil also one of the recently finalized project of AgwA, which is a secondary school in Antwerp called Durlet, in which, through a series of constraints, the project unveils a very specific and singular relationship with its historical context. So I propose David to come. Thank you for being here.
For the invitation. I will just try to first find back the lecture or the piece I'm presenting on the screen somewhere. Wow. Okay, great. Benoit already told you what I will show you, but it was important, I guess, within the context of the In Practice lecture, for us to also give you an idea about Bahrain. Because working abroad is something else. It's another country. Already first image, this is a picture taken from the hotel room when we woke up the next morning. This is a view on the kind of a main road in Manama, and Manama is the capital of the island. Because Bahrain, as you probably know, is an island. It's an island, tiny island in the Arabic Sea, next to Saudi Arabia and close to the Emirates, next to Doha. And it is an island which, in its context, is actually very amazing. I mean, it's something as a special jewel, you could say, in the middle of that quite a desert-like landscape. And it's known in history, and this is really, something which I could talk for hours about, but it's known as Eden. The Eden was actually Bahrain, because Bahrain means two waters, and two waters in Arabic means two waters, and two waters means you have the sea, but you have actually fresh water on the island, coming from the seabed. And so there were a lot of palm trees, and it's really, it has been known for thousands of years as one of the most lush areas in the Arabic area of that side. So, but that's a whole other lecture, I would say. But just to get you know a bit about the place. And I will introduce even where we are in Bahrain through another project, which is called the Pearl Path in Bahrain. It's a let's say a landscaping project that we did together with Bureau Bas Metz, with Bas. And so actually, this is the northern tip of the island, and we see the actual capital. It's a Manama, and I don't know if you see any of my... No, there's no pointers. But on top where you see the white dot, there's actually an even older piece of town, which is called Muharraq. And well, this is the most, let's say, civilized, or this is the area where all the people live of the island. This is really where the island, or the whole country, has about 800,000 inhabitants, and actually mainly all of them live in that area, at least 90%. The rest is actually quite desert-like. And as you can see, a lot of Arabic Sea is present in this insular constellation. And this is the actual part which is called Muharraq. Muharraq is actually the starting center of development of Bahrain. And Bahrain, since its history, has been so long, also had a very recent history, which is actually, this is a picture from the 1930s. And you see it's an Arabic labyrinthic city that lays and touches really the sea. And there's a fortress in the foreground, and in the background you really see the Arabic maze, typically known for cities of let's say, older age in that world. And it's beautiful. It is also surrounded by the sea, and an enormous economy before oil was discovered was actually the pearl business. So a lot of pearls were found in the sea around it, and a lot of people were into the trade of pearls. And so this is actually a picture of one of these fishing boats that pearl divers would use to go and look for pearls in the shallow seabeds of the Bahraini waters. Today, this is a picture of, let's say, today, more or less. There's been so many things that changed. Land reclamation started in the 50s, and for instance, the white area you can see here is actually what you just saw in the picture before. That's the actual footprint of the island, but it extended because of the shallow seas. They just extended with the wealth of oil. Suddenly the whole island changed. What is kind of beautiful is that the centerpiece still is preserved as a kind of a core of old city within it. And so when we were asked, and this I'm now speaking about 2010, so 10 years ago, actually we were in the Biennale of Venice, and we won the Silver Lion at that time. We on the stage, we were together with Bahrain, who won as a country the Golden Lion, and Rem Koolhaas won the Golden Lion for a lifetime achievement and so on. But anyway, we got to know the Minister of Culture of Bahrain, Sheikh Hamay. She was a female Minister of Culture, and together with the right hand, Noura Al-Sayed, they asked us if we wanted to think about this heritage of Bahrain with a few questions. And I actually should, I think, be a bit faster, but this introduction is important to understand the context of the actual project I will speak about. This is one of these alleys, these labyrinthic streets with lots of old buildings and courtyards, doors, air conditionings. This is the Siadi complex. It's a mosque and a pearl trade center, actually. which is of course not anymore like that. Other places which are like commercials, shopping areas in that very dense maze. Corners, and again, beautiful old buildings that are standing there, that some of them are out of use, others are still used. And they're all like making this enormously beautiful, almost like what we imagine of an Arabic city, this beautiful patchwork of streets, of alleys, and of courtyards. And within it, you find really beautiful buildings of the Arabic culture of that area, with wind towers, as you can see here, catching wind to bring the breeze down into the building. And most of these buildings are actually related to the pearl business. This is, for instance, the captain that would be on the boat. He had a house in the city. This is the captain's house. Then again, all these courtyards and plastered walls. And of course, this city has been transforming since the 30s or even the start of the century to become added with more and modern and more new constructions, but still making the same city with these very, very labyrinthic streets and buildings. And so, within that context, we were asked by the ministry to think of what they called at the time a pearl path or pearl pathway. There are many names for it, but actually this was a route that they had in mind that would connect all the traces, all these beautiful buildings that they were at the time already starting to restore. The actual pearl trade that was already present and always has been present. How could we do that, and how could you make it somehow visible? And together with Bas Metz, we made this map. This is actually a kind of summary map where you can see the old contours of the island. Let's say the smallest print, then the water, where the water is today, and actually within that, let's say, network, we traced this blue line, which is 3.5 kilometers from the sea, let's say, towards in the center, and that was the Siadi complex in the top here of the image, and it passes all this kind of very beautiful and very old pieces of city. And attached to that are 20 monuments that are actual buildings related to the pearl trade of the time. So going from, as I showed you, the captain's house, to the fisherman's house, to the actual trading place, to the mosque, to the mejlis, to the etc. So many places that relate to the other, market halls, etc. And all these had a certain monumental value on the site. At the same time, we had to somehow connect that, and that was not easy. And actually, if you take away, let's say, what we had, then we discovered there were like maybe around that on that trail something like a 20-25 opportunities, we call them. Opportunities were actually just like holes in the maze that were like buildings that were demolished, that were just making suddenly an opening in the maze. And we said, what if we use these opportunities to put a kind of micro plaza in the maze? And in that micro public moment, we create a kind of points of rest, you could say, on the trail. And at the same time, we create a certain help, we called it. It's as in the kind of fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel that leave the trail of crumbles. We create a certain help to find your way from, let's say, monument to little place to etc. And you could say that all these things together, they form a bigger entity, a kind of almost bigger European-sized plaza. So that project, well, these were first collages that we made. You see here a first attempt of a small micro place. It was also an idea of keeping away the cars to plant trees, really. And that's not just to keep away the cars, but actually to create shade, because we're talking about a very, very hot place where shade and trees are really welcome. And then indeed this kind of help, these crumbles that would lead you through this insane labyrinth. I mean, even today, and we've been many times there, we couldn't find our way back. If you walk through it, it really needs years of experience. And so with the help, you could find the crumbles and connect the dots and do the walk. But at the same time, it was also to end, finally also, by the way, crossing this enormous road they made to the sea, where the actual old fort was also at. Today we are building the bridge as well. The bridge is, well, somebody of the offices today actually in Bahrain controlling the works on the bridge, but I won't show that today. But anyway, these little micro plazas, you could say, they would introduce in this maze some moments of gathering, some kind of floor with trees, with lights, with the drinking fountain, kind of with a bench, moments that somehow create some kind of moments of exception, and also where the density of the maze is gone because of the opportunity, but at the same time where the trees replace that density of the, let's say, the buildings that were there before. And this is finally how it looks like. So with Bas, we selected the Dolonix tree, which is a local tree. It has these beautiful leaves that filter the light, and at the same time we created the floor in concrete, the lamp is in concrete, the drinking well, the drinking fountain is in concrete. So you get these elements that make a kind of moment where, like a small platform within the maze of the city. And these are actually photos that we just got sent by Noura. It's because the project, together with other projects on the Pearling Trail, won the Aga Khan Award of 2019. And so these are pictures that have been taken by a local photographer that show how these places start to, let's say, interact with monuments. That was actually the captain's house I just showed you before, is now restored and is used and still needs some trees to grow, but it's going well. And as you can see, you find your way through actually a very robust set of lamps that go through the let's say, the maze. We also didn't want to make a flooring all over the place, but rather these lights would lead you until deep in the maze, where every time you can find along the lines or one of these opportunities, or at least, let's say, one of these monuments that are also visitable. But so as an introduction, this is a very long introduction to show you one of the projects that we made also parallelly with this pearl path, which is Dar Al Jina. So Benoit already introduced the name. Dar Al Jina, and this is a collage we made at the same time, and it looks very much like the previous collages of the pearl path. But it was actually the first project we started to make, and later on came the pearl path. Dar Al Jina is connected to is in Muharraq, in the same place. And it's connected again to the pearl industry that actually has vanished. And how is it connected? Well, these are pearl divers. They go and fish for pearls. Well, they did do that, but on the boat, and then also when returning home, they would make this music, very, very basic music of clapping, let's say percussion on pots, and dancing. And so we were actually introduced to them, and they still perform their music, and the Ministry of Culture asked us to think of a building, actually, in this spot. This is in the middle of the Arabic maze, and you see two cars parked in the kind of void in the middle of the image. But next to it is actually a house. And now I think you can see the pointer. Yes, here it is. Well, this part is what they call dar. Dar in Arabic means house. So it's a very simple word, but dar also means actually the house for these musicians. And they play music in typical rooms in these houses as they would return from home. But the music is a traditional music, and the Ministry of Culture wanted that heritage to stay alive and to also be, again, more active in the tissue of the city, and not make a museum out of it, but rather an active center for traditional music. And the site that was vacant here, with the two cars, they said, could you make something there that would be able to do that? And well, this is finally the footprint of our project. So it's kind of following the idea of the maze and trying to make an extension to the existing Dar al-Jinnah. And so it inscribes itself really literally in this very dense maze of the city of Muharraq. At the same time, it's a building that in its figure relates to, let's say, what is an old building in that tissue, which is only a one-story house, typically with a courtyard, or what are more new buildings, let's say, which are 3 floors high. And so this building tries to somehow mediate that by inscribing itself with its kind of tapered shape. So it's a 3-story building with, on the ground floor, there's a performance space, so a music space. On the 2nd floor, an educational center, and on the 3rd floor, there is actually a residencies for musicians. And the original space, or Jinnah, Dar al-Jinnah, is on the left side of the image. And it has the courtyard. And so somehow we like the idea of these rooms, because the plan of these original houses are very simple. They have these rooms surrounding a courtyard. And we made just another room, you could say, next to it. At the same time, the room is actually a sort of a building and becomes a stack of 3 rooms. And how we made that was by creating a certain set of layering of let's say, how you call it, sort of more intimacy. Intimacy is the word. So because in that context, and actually the whole maze, everything is turned inward around this courtyard, but we didn't have a place to make a courtyard. We tried many times, but finally came down to 1 building, 1 space per floor. And the relation with the existing courtyard was made by just not filling the entire site and having a kind of a small annex that of the street going between. And then here again, the building, how 3 floors relate, let's say, to the existing building. floor plans, all the same. It's almost like a small temple, a set of columns, a perimeter, a room. A room that can be many things. It is a performance space, it is an educational center, or it is even 2 rooms on top for 2 residencies. And at the same time, furniture like scatters around in the perimeter or inside the room. It's a model that we made at the time to somehow show also how it would stand in this context, with its tapered shape, and how it relates to the existing building from the top. And this is a cross-section, or actually the model without its skin. Because, why do I say skin? Because the building is actually a very simple construction. It is, you could call it structure. It is boxes, as you could call them, within the structure. And there's a skin hanging over, or like say, surrounding this structure. And that's how we made a kind of, you could say, a stacking of these rooms in a contemporary way. There's a stair, there are some air conditioning units, there are, of course, toilets, there are some electricity cabinets, there's the main spaces themselves, they're all kind of boxes. And finally, there's the skin covering everything. The skin also somehow mediating with its context in a, call it now, visual way, but also in a that talks about intimacy, but also in a climatic way, because it's super hot there. So first, structure. So structure, you saw these 3 floors, concrete slabs, and we wanted to make many columns actually, many round concrete columns, but that would on themselves be stable to hold up the building. That made us, make this first sketch. What is actually important is it's a rigid connection of the slab and the column. And finally, this was calculated first by a Belgian engineer, then finally also because everything had to be translated by and then recalculated by a local engineer. And we made this system where, let's say, the columns really were full of steel and could resist a certain moment in the connection with the slab. With these coupler boxes, I remember it was with Rolf, we did this calculations that extend back in the slab. So you could make a rigid structure without crosses, etc. Just some columns. Or many columns actually. And we liked the amount of columns because it somehow created the first, you could say, layer of intimacy. This is a cross-section of the column. So you see all the rebars in there. These are, of course, making the column stiff, but especially making the connection with the plate stiff. And on the same page, you can see on the right side, actually some of these columns were fake. Because we didn't want extra ducts, extra weird, how you call them, shafts in the project. We actually said, couldn't we not run electricity and water, etc., and maybe even air conditioning, cooling pipes into the columns. In some of them, we made them in steel. So you have this kind of 2 types of columns. And so this column story was actually very tough, because first of all, it had to be full of this steel, and they tried first a column of 1 meter, then 2 meters, but finally they had to reach 4 meters to make a round column. And this was the first or the final attempt that they managed to do it well. So they made for many things a mock-up, and it's one of these mock-ups. And finally we could start the process of pouring all these columns. And of course, And again, back to the side, this is the foundation, which already shows you the rebar sticking out. The neighbor, which is this very beautiful cemented wall, and actually the yellow wall in the middle is the existing building of Dar El Jinnah. And here, first slab is up. We used very basic PVC pipes to cast the concrete in, and then they kept the PVC around it to protect the concrete columns. So they were cast on site, they are not prefabricated. Also the connection with the slab was very important, that it was a clean connection, because the slab is visible, would stay visible, and cold bridges, let's say, are not an issue in Bahrain, where the minimum temperature is, I think, like 15 degrees, and that's really when it's extremely cold. So, so anyway, this is, and then you see even a kind of place where there's a hole in the slab. That was for airco unit that can be fitted within. And here there's a stair that finally we decided to make the stairs in as well like the slab in on-site cast in situ concrete. And here you see 3 columns on the left, let's say, in concrete, and the 4th column, which is a duct column. The stair going up, which was used for the poster, and the structure being made on site and growing, and again making the 2nd slab. And these were also mock-ups that were made at the time. Again, this was a long process. We worked very hard on all this kind of micro details together with our local office, Emar Consulting they're called, a real Bahraini architecture firm that does rather like construction detailing. But these are like electricity switches on the steel column. We were thinking of a little hatch. How would you integrate them on a round curve? Finally, they are straight units to be mounted, etc. So. And that all this was a very important, let's say, research. And then there's the boxes. The boxes, well, you can see finally this is some kind of collage we made of what could be the boxes like, and there's blue boxes and orange ones, and well, the main story is the orange boxes, because the blue boxes are electricity cabinets, are other cupboards, our toilet, our this kind of more technical things. The orange ones are the actual spaces, and these are made out of, you could say, steel frames with glass, but within it still a kind of a wooden perforated paneling. Again, the plan, and you see more and more technical, it went very far, of course, but the wooden floor, the kind of perimeter of the wall of the room in glass with actual paneling, the section of it, how these details worked. I could show many of these details, but maybe that would lead us very far. And also how, and that's a very important thing in the Arabic culture, how there is something about layering, and there's this musharab, as we know, the kind of filtering of the outside world coming in, and it's all about light and about being intimate or more exposed, and all of these elements we started to detail like that. Then how can you make these different layers within the building? At the same time, and this is a sketch of a ceiling and a floor, which would become also a kind of a holder of many things. So there had to be acoustical, had to be music, had to be speakers, it had to have many things, and so the whole ceiling slash floor also became extremely important as an idea. And these are again on site. You can see the folding doors, they are like accordion doors in steel. And the ceiling with the micro perforation for acoustics, but also for light and air conditioning. And then the first tests of this paneling that would also open and close and give you the possibility to be more or less private. And the floor as well. This is like a first mock-up or test of how that would work. So you have a totally perforated paneling wall with glass, and then the same glass wall can move on the side and be actually totally open. And finally, the skin. The skin is something which is, of course, finally also making the project. It is something we put a lot of effort in, and it's made out of this ring mesh, chain mesh, if you want, the actual knights around the round table mesh. It is all kinds of small rings connected, and that make all together, you could say, a metallic tissue. And we were very interested in this because it's like on the scale of a building, it is like something you could make the building wear. It's like a dress. It is extremely performing in the sense that it is actually giving a lot of shade to the interior, which it needs, and the wind can still go through, and somehow it is extremely flexible. And that was also a very important reason, you can extend this endlessly. So a ring goes into another ring, goes into another ring. This is just a little piece, but you can combine all kinds of pieces together to become one big, enormous tissue on the scale of a building. And actually we really designed it as a piece, as a dress for the building. A dress that could be tailored literally, and that has a certain attachments, but has also a cut to go into it, kind of an opening where you could go daily use, let's say, in and out. But also, and that's extremely important to add, it is also something you could, like a little theater, because we're talking about musicians and performing, you could open it in a kind of new way that the whole skin or tissue or skirt can be pulled up. And that was actually with the, this just to give you an idea, we're talking about like a building of at least 25 meters long, on 17 meters high. It's something that is quite big in terms of size, and we managed to do that without any joints. I heard the concert started, so I'm already very late. These are tests of the actual ring mesh. We found a local supplier in Bahrain, quality wire mesh, that makes this mesh. And first test of, let's say, mock-ups of how we could make the mesh move. And then it is a whole level of detailing that actually was engineered around a tissue, around the ring mesh, where you could open it up in the bottom with a kind of an engine that would roll up and start to make all the details of the slab together, how you would pull up the mesh. Actually, this ring mesh, it weighs 12 kilo per square meter, so that's quite a lot. So it needs really an engineering. Now it's really starting down here. Anyway, more. So the mesh, they put it. So pieces were made 1 by 1 meter and then assembled on site and literally tailored around the building. And these are pictures of how it looks in the, let's say, context top from the street. Actually, here you can see this kind of relation with the courtyard existing, which we also cleaned up. In the city, finally, this is the main performance space, which can totally open up. but also totally close. That's the system I was using, showing, and you could sit, and that's what they do, sit on the floor. That's why the paneling below is not perforated. The educational floor with the perforated ceiling, stairs between the skin and the structure, and the top floor, let's say, where the residencies are, again overlooking the city. And these are pictures taken by Bas, these last pictures, Bas Prinsen, who we always work with. It shows this layering and this kind of like the importance of all these layers. And I just want to show you two little movies to finish, which are actually how this building performs actually in its context, because Bas was there on a Ramadan moment and so it wasn't used. But these are actual moments in the city as it is working every weekend. They do concerts. So everybody, the whole neighborhood comes, and here the curtain is still down, or the mesh, it's still down, and the musicians, they're in place, they're already playing, and you see that the mesh is actually has a certain silver presence, and it's filtering in this case, but it also has this shininess. And at the same time, what is very important and beautiful to see is that, and it's every time like that, that's the whole neighborhood is activated and comes in these small alleys to come to look at the concerts. The mesh is going up here, and yeah, the musicians keep on playing, and you see it revealing its interior, literally, with this kind of area between the columns and the room. This is you see the guy who was doing a little dance, that's also the leader of the musicians. They're still doing there's many of these groups. This is one of the main DAR. They do it, they invite many other musicians from different areas of the peninsula. And you see the instruments hang on the perforations. That was Kersten, you saw. And yeah, I think there you can see one of these steel columns, by the way, the shiny one, the shiny steel column. And again, everybody there, and I can assure you, and that's really been confirmed by everybody involved in the project locally, that this is every Friday and Saturday, or Saturday actually, the whole city or the neighborhood comes to enjoy the concerts, and people are actually also starting to again get very interested in this music, in what they do, these musicians, how they, well, are a tradition, but somehow still are part of the city and still are making this music alive in the neighborhood. Some more people sitting in air conditioning. Thank you.
Okay, so I will talk to you about a project more nearby. It's in Antwerp. It's a project I think we finished a couple of years ago. And maybe I should especially thank Thomas Montiletti, collaborator at the office, who was the driving force behind the project. At the office, many of the projects we do are won through competitions. Here it's not the case. It's a special system that they have in the city of Antwerp for smaller projects. This was not such a small project, but it was through the system. which makes that we could directly start to have discussions with the client. When often in competitions it's a kind of, you make a proposal without having real contacts, and it's a little bit different. So we have this situation, it's an ancient building, it's in a style which is called Neo-Flemish Renaissance style, it really exists. And it's a kind of a heavy ornamental architecture. During the Second World War, the building was heavily damaged, and you can see here that the context also evolved quite a lot around it. The building today, the central part is quite preserved, but the wings, the 4 wings around the building were completely demolished, and 3 of them were rebuilt in the 50s in quite blunt concrete structures. And there is 1 wing missing in the school. So the city wants to complete the school with a secondary school and ask us to build the 4th wing. This is the place, a little bit undefined, or maybe in between many things. There is a big apartment block neighboring the site, which changes a little bit the possibilities on the site. When we received the brief to design this new wing of the building, there is already a feasibility study which is developed by Lichtervelde Architecten. And in fact what they do there is to check that the site is able to catch the program, and second, to see how it can react to the urbanistic regulations. And you see that there is an issue is that this apartment block is just there, and so we need to keep some distance. And in fact, it's not much more than that. But the issue is that, of course, then there is already a pre-agreement from the urbanistic services, which say this you can do. And then we inherit that as a kind of start of the project. We made a small model in order to see what it meant to build this, and we felt a little bit unhappy with that because it is like if it tries to maintain the symmetry of the building, to create a second lateral courtyard, but without really achieving it because it's more narrow, it's a little bit thicker, the building, and also less or shorter. So it's a kind of attempt to imitate what is already there, but doesn't really allow to achieve it. So we try some variations. Maybe we depart again from a white page, saying, okay, this is the site that we have, and how can we maybe try to interpret this contrast in a different way. There is a possibility maybe to put more things on the ground floor in a different way. There is also, you see that one of the lateral buildings of the central courtyard is lower than the other, so in the reconstruction they took some liberties with the existing buildings. We could maybe even try to build on top of the existing structures, but the central buildings are protected heritage, so probably this will not be a feasible option. And then quite quickly we attempt to do something completely different, a kind of maybe a kind of UFO landing there in this in the place of the missing wing. In fact, it's a simple cube which is rotated 45 degrees in order to address the courtyard differently, to have a small basement which would negotiate the relation with the courtyard, and maybe to create a relationship with the apartment building which would be less frontal. Quite surprisingly, the city of Antwerp, the service of the schools, was quite enthusiastic about the proposal. saying, but we will need to see if it works on the urbanistic level, of course, but let's try it. We will give it a try and attempt it. Which is a quite nice situation that we do not really have very often in public projects because of this moment of the competition in which heavy decisions are made that really influence the entire process. But in this case, there is the possibility to try something, and if it doesn't work, then we would be able to change it also. So from there, the variations starting on this idea of the rotated cube, in which you see that there is a cantilever appearing over the courtyard, and we see on the images a small tower in the corner, which is the elevator shaft, which is there is some research there on where it could be placed in order to help the structure. And then some pictures are taken of the model to see what it means to integrate this strange form in the quite dense context of all these buildings and roofs of the school. Immediately, it's also a kind of, it reminds us of the Openluchtschool of Jan Duiker in Amsterdam. You know, it's this cubic school which is placed in the interior of a building block, freeing space around it, and the structure is also quite important there. So there is this kind of imagination that is there, but also it resonates with other projects at the office that date from longer, like this competition for a school restaurant in Philippeville in 2008, in which you see it's the red square there in the middle. There is maybe an interest to see what happens if you place an object in a context without having this object articulating itself to the context, but rather placing it maybe in a way that you could imagine that it's the context that is evolving around this placed object. So it's about the precision of the placement rather than looking for the articulation. This was another competition for a high-level sports school in Antwerp, which is doing something similar, placing this square object in the middle of the context. Sometimes it's not square, could be also a triangle, but it's always a kind of shape which is self-referential in a way, but then placed very carefully. Or it can also sometimes work negatively. This is a project for a memorial in El Salvador, Central America, in which it's a definition of a square in the middle of a plantation of trees, which is then placed on the spot in a specific way. But then also the imagination expands about what it is to provide this kind of central elements that change the space around them. So there we have this kind of starting point now that is completely different from the feasibility study, and we can start to check the program, and we can start making the plans. We immediately see that there will be some issues to solve, like the two staircases that do not really respond to the kind of shift or rotation between the two plans. But the plans get developed, and then there is also in parallel a reflection about the skin of the building. And in a first stage we imagine that it could be this kind of structure, probably concrete structure, with what could be a metallic, quite shiny skin around it, in order to start playing with reflections and light and really play this role of UFO in the context. Then it is time to go to present that to the Welstandscommissie, it's the urbanistic commission in Antwerp, And I remember it was very rainy and we arrived completely drenched, so probably they got some pity for us and they found it quite interesting. But there were two comments that were made on the project. One is about the materiality, and the reflection was that the other buildings around it from the 50s, they are not very interesting. It's rectangular windows in a regular base, it's quite flat, it's not a very enthusiastic architecture. And they were wondering if you do this kind of a very acrobatic architecture and you wrap it in steel or aluminium, it will become a kind of jewel there, and it's not very fair for the pupils that are in the old buildings. So maybe could you find something that would be a little bit more modest or in phase with the context? And then also they questioned why 45 degrees? Why do you rotate it 45 degrees and not another angle? And could you maybe give it a reflection to question this angle? So on the one side we were quite happy that there was this positive appreciation, and at the same time wondering why they would question this 45 degrees. It's only an angle, it's not so important. But then we obeyed and explored a little bit what this angle could mean, and we found out that by respecting the rules of the urbanism, you see this here, this 15 meters, this point is fixed, and we can rotate the cube until the point that the other corner touches the other facade, and then by coincidence this point also almost touches the corner. So it's like by rotating the cube, at some point it clicks to the basement. From there we can make some very rough simulations, and we see these kind of encounters that appear here and there, which promise to be complicated angles or junctions to solve on the construction site, but also show that there is something happening. From there, the plans get a kind of definitive form, and you see, what we see also that will appear is that the confrontation, you see the marker, between the cube on top and the basement, there will be a kind of interface there that will be the moment in which the two levels negotiate each other, which may mean something. The circle here is a terrace on the roof, and maybe this could also become something meaningful for the level below. You see this strange figure here in the corner, which is there because of the rotation of the staircase, so the staircase moves from one level to another, creating a kind of extra margin or extra space that will probably change a little bit the perception of things. And then we have the upper floors, which are let's say, the more normal classrooms. For the materiality, the reflection evolves after the meeting with the urbanism, and we look back at other projects that are on construction site at the moment. This is a sports hall in Perron, near Tournai, in which there are some existing buildings in concrete blocks, and we have this idea that maybe the concrete blocks, they also are a kind of reminiscence of these public infrastructures when we were young, the schools, the sports centers, these kind of places, very robust, very normal also in a way, and that maybe it could be also an answer to that. Also, what they propose, this kind of materiality of the concrete blocks and the lintels and the roof lines, is that they start to produce a kind of language, a grammar, that we can develop in order to define an architecture. At the same time, there is a theater hall, also in construction at the office in Schaerbeek, using the same kind of language, and we're thinking maybe we can give it a try to see what it means for this levitating block in Durlet. So there are experimental drawings, trying to see what different layouts can mean. Maybe it's a kind of patchwork, maybe it's a very homogeneous way of assembling the blocks. And then looking more in detail or developing the reflection about that, there is of course always the angle is a particular moment, and as the blocks are 9 cm thick and 40 long, if you don't want to cut blocks, then you have on the corner this kind of distance of 9 cm, which define the entire layout. So you see here, for example, in this small extract, it's not the traditional half layout, but it's only a shift of 9 cm, which changes each stop, and then becomes the way of defining the moment in which the windows will stop, and then the lintels become part of it, and it becomes an entire language. Also on the interior, this resonates with the masonry and the structural beams in concrete. So these are all images that were created along the reflection, but that were not really meant as a kind of presentation, even if they were shown to the client to discuss it. But as there is no competition, again, there is never a kind of a start presentation in which we have to kind of sell the project, because we are already in the process from the beginning. We make a scale model with these textures only for internal use. And then this drawing, which is a kind of synthesis of all the reflection, in which we have this masonry, the elevator block in blue, and then some other elements like this reminiscence of this shiny intention that we had at the beginning is the technical room on top of the building. There is the cantilever, would also maybe be this kind of shiny or mirrored surface, and then the terrace on the roof of the basement here. We had the idea that it could also be something like that, as a kind of new materials added where needed on the building. Then the execution file is made, and that's the moment in which we think that maybe it's time to do some representation of the project in a more detailed and precise way. And we made some, a little bit, some would say 90s looking cut drawings from the 4 elevations with the context, and to have for the first time, in fact, a complete look at what the project would be. Then looking further in the execution file, there is the question of the materialities, also in the interior, and you have all these monsters that are gathered through time at the office of quite rough, cheap materials, and by combining them we create this kind of, or we find this kind of collection of things. And we think maybe that could be interesting to have this kind of spirit inside. Not the spirit of the materials, but more the spirit of the encounter of these materials, that they could simply be juxtaposed in this way. A little bit like the rotation of the cube provokes a number of situations that simply appear in the project. So it's another series of drawings that explore specific situations from the inside. And it's funny to see how this simple movement of the rotation creates really a series of moments which are quite unexpected. Here we see what I was telling about the ceiling of the basement, in which you see the round shape of the terrace imprinted in the roof. And in which we think these drawings were made in order to explore not the appearance of these shapes, but rather how the techniques could react to that. And what you see in this drawing is the idea that where the shapes encounter each other. For example, in the circle, the techniques would appear, but in the lower parts they would disappear in the structure. On the levels, it's more a kind of simple, pragmatic layout of the techniques. The exterior space appears too, also as a kind of consequence of the presence of the building. Some structural issues. It's interesting how it becomes the occasion of many small focuses. It is hard to understand really what appears there, unless that it is a very sustained attention for details that appear everywhere, and that are always a consequence of the encounter of the two volumes. The ceiling of the cantilever. And then we go to the construction site. This is the plan of the formwork. It means also the drawing now leaves the realm of the office and lands in the hands of the contractor, which sends back our drawings modified in a way. This is the impossible encounter of the cube and the basement, in which we would like everything to come together in one point, which is technically a kind of impossibility. The drawing of the contractor, in which the structure is already present, and then you see it draws on the picture the brickwork and the insulation in order to be as precise as possible. And we can start looking at the emerging structure on the construction site, also from points of view that we had not anticipated. So it's quite interesting to at once discover the emergence of this almost tower in the middle of a quite diverse context. From the central courtyard of the school, to be compared to the very first picture of the model. The negative shapes in the ceiling of the basement, which create a kind of quite exciting moments on the construction site when these unexpected elements become reality. There is, of course, the proximity of the context. This is looking towards the school, and the corner is really very near to the other constructions, which makes that the angle leaves really a kind of breath to the site. And very different situations also. On every level, you receive, thanks to this rotation, very different views on the context. And then at the end, the building stands there, ready to receive the students. There is a part of it is what was anticipated, what happens, what we have seen in the drawings that were produced, in the scale models, in the renders. It's quite a correct transcription of it. The impossible angle is even quite well realized. And then there are also some more unexpected elements, like for the proximity with the other building, some windows have to be replaced by fireproof windows. But at the same time, we wanted the opening parts of the windows of the new building to be maybe in green and not in grey as the rest, so as to identify them. But the contractor made an error and ordered everything in grey, so this did not happen, which maybe was a better solution. But then the error was also that he ordered green windows for the fireproof one, so it was a complete mix of the colors. But in fact, it's quite nice when you see the image that the green color, which is used for the furniture inside the new building, at once appears as a kind of anecdote or small detail that refers, that echoes the building. So I'm lucky. A quite interesting tension between the two buildings there. A very narrow passage. But this is in fact what we had anticipated. The relationship with the apartments and the rotated volume. And the diversity of the views, which is really quite interesting when you walk into the building. There are two staircases and you can almost get lost and discover new spaces all the time in the school. But then more interestingly, through the eye of the photographer, the building starts to resonate with the context in some very specific moments. There's, for example, this huge brick chimney that is there, which we have not really seen at the first time, but we have then the elevator shaft, which is a kind of, it's not really a copy, the proportions are not the same, but together they really define the character of the playground here. And it's maybe a sign that something, just as the rotation of the block at some point clicked on the basement, there is a kind of click moment also here between the realized project and the environment. Well, this picture I like very much, in which the tower, the blind brick wall in the background, the shape of the roof and the diagonal block, they all together make a kind of a crazy combination, but they are talking the same language in a way, simply through the game of the triangles and of the angles. So this kind of resonance with the context. And this picture also, if you look well, you see the reflections in the windows, and in the lower windows it's the mirror of the right part, so it's simply the prolongation of the building. But it seems that on the first level it's also a kind of echo of the same building, but in fact it's the building in the back. But it seems that again there is some play that happens there, that a second way of seeing the building which happens. And then there are all these small moments that happen inside the building, the consequence of this first movement of the rotation, in which some columns appear in some strange positions that seem to be almost undesigned. They simply happen in that way. One is in concrete, the other is in steel, because the structure asks for it. So maybe to refer to the steel column in the Argina, there is something maybe similar there, in which the columns they can change their nature if it's needed. Of course, here it's rather the expression of a diversity that simply happens. This is the place where the staircase moves from one place to another, and then there is this small, inexplicable triangular space with one door, which is completely inaccessible, but which becomes also part of the magic of the place. Referring to the patchwork of materials, that was as a kind of base of the reflection. The materials are simply put where they are needed in the way it happens, in a way, on the construction site. There is the acoustic absorbent on the ceiling, which is placed in the lower part, but not in the recessed higher part. There is the perforated acoustic panels in the background. On the right part, it's perforated on the right, but not on the left, because on the other side there is another classroom, and there it's inverted. You see also the radiators, they are simply placed in the way they are placed. And this kind of, you could say, not wanting of designing it too much or controlling it too much makes that there is a kind of invitation of maybe using, of even misusing the place that is quite welcome. This is a piece of aluminium that was used for the sealing of the cantilever that was cut in a half circle in order to cover a small error in the structure. Instead of demolishing and rebuilding, we propose to cover it with, again, something that at first sight maybe you could not explain. And then this maybe is a kind of combination between what was planned, what is the consequence of this first movement of the rotation, and what simply happens with the fire cabinet there. And then there is a wooden frame of the door, the concrete, even the A3 paper with the evacuation plan, which is temporarily put there. And all together, they fit in the image. Thank you.